Okay, so we continue on with our series called Counterformed. Here's the concept. Every culture has main cultural narratives. Those are the ideas that shape the culture. They're like the soundtrack for our lives. And every culture has them, and every culture is being formed by them. Whether you know it or not, it's just your atmosphere. And so last week we looked at one of the cultural narratives, which is for Americans especially a super deep one, more than other countries. And that's the you do you of hyper-individualism. We talked about this, got her. Today we actually explore a narrative that every culture and every country is deeply formed by throughout time. So this is probably the widest narrative shared by the most people. And it's this. It would go like this. No one gets away with anything. So if you're wronged, make them pay. It's the narrative of retribution, vengeance, payback. Basically, if you're wronged, you have a duty to make sure that whoever wronged you gets paid back for that wrong. That is so old. I mean, it is old, 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 and deep, deep, deep. Everybody's formed by it. It's part of our DNA. And just to give you an example of how widespread this is, the ubiquity of this, there's a whole genre of films called revenge films. Do you know this? A whole genre. Here's one example of it, next slide. Right? Revenge films, they're everywhere. IMDb lists 100 of the top revenge films. I'm not going to read all the titles, I'm going to read some. But just to let you know, these are oftentimes massive blockbusters. And they are premised on the old device of payback, vengeance. I'll read some titles to you. These are old and new. I mean, they're all over the place. Let me read them to you. Ben-Hur, The Godfather, The Punisher, The Count of Monte Cristo. Jaws, weirdly, it's a revenge film about seeking revenge to and from a shark, right? I mean, that's how deep revenge, it works for even a shark. Revenge films. Other ones, The Gladiator, The Revenant, The Last of the Mohicans, True Grit, Taken, The Equalizers, 1 through 3, every James Bond movie, even The Princess Bride, and pretty much every movie ever made by Mel Gibson, Clint Eastwood, or Quentin Tarantino are revenge films. And the question is, why are so many revenge films made? Not rhetorical. Yeah, they work. That old trope of revenge and payback works. So they keep pumping them out. It's an old device, but it's an effective one. It taps into some primal feelings we have. It's anger. It's a sense of justice, and it's a lust for payback. That's why it works. Nothing's new. Revenge, revenge, revenge. It's so deep in our DNA that if you choose not to take revenge where you can, you're looked at almost with suspicion. Like you're either naive or you're gullible, that you wouldn't take revenge. Here's an example of that. If you just go on YouTube and you look up what are some examples of Christians that give grace and forgiveness instead of revenge, and that's a popular, find one that's popular, like 1 million views. If you read through the comments, you're going to find suspicion, cynicism. There will be questions like, or comments like fake news or eye-rolling emojis, because simply our culture can't understand forgiveness. Not forgiveness where it would be so easy and justified for you to mete out revenge. So that cultural narrative is uber deep. No one gets away with anything. It's a command. No one gets away with anything. If you've been wronged, make them pay. Revenge. So in our culture where forgiveness is seen like a phobia and payback is so deep, the question is there a different narrative that could counterform us? Well, that's what we're going to explore this morning. Let's go into the most famous prayer in the world. It's the Lord's Prayer. Here's how it came about. Luke 11. Now Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he had finished, one of his disciples said to him, Lord, teach us to pray, as John taught his disciples. So the disciples are asking Jesus to counterform them with ideas which are counter to the culture right there. And Jesus said, pray like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So let's focus on 11 through 13. I'm going to reread that quick. Here we go. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. So notice that in asking for our daily bread, or our basic needs, Christ encourages that, but he also creates two dependent clauses. That's the ands. I underline them. And they're really as if to say, you need daily bread to survive, but you're also going to need forgiveness and help in temptation. Like if you want to live well and flourish, you're not going to just need daily bread, clothes in your back, shelter. You're actually also going to need the ability to forgive and help in temptation. We're focusing on forgiveness this morning. Next week we'll talk about temptation. But let me reread it one more time. Verse 12, and forgive us our debts as we have also forgiven our debtors. Or let me read this in a really wooden but literal way. To translate it this way, you might pray, Father, cancel our debt of sin as we also cancel the sin debt of others. Cancel our debt of sin as we also cancel the sin debt of others. Both those terms, cancel and debt, are accounting terms in the ancient Near East. And it's right. Those are actually terms. It is debt. And it means sin debt, but it's accounting terms, and it's good because there is an economy to sin. I mean it this way. If somebody harms somebody else, every time, somebody has to pay for that. If somebody harms somebody else, it always has to be paid for. That's what sin does. It creates a debt that has to be paid. For example, if somebody slanders your reputation, either you're going to take that hit or you're going to seek payback slander. That's how it works. Somebody has to pay for that. Also, if you're in a relationship where somebody betrays you, either you pay or the other person will pay for that betrayal. If at work somebody makes a mistake, a costly mistake, somebody will pay for that mistake. Now the question is, who pays for it? Well, you can choose either vengeance or forgiveness. That will determine who pays, but somebody will pay for it. That's the economy, the moral economy of sin. It will always be paid for. Somebody must pay. The choice is forgiveness or vengeance. Now, I've had very few major sin debts accrued against me. In my really sheltered life, I've had very few people have no super deep marks and scars in my soul. I was raised by great parents in this sheltered place in a rural context, and just so thick blessing, really good. The only sin debts that have been accrued against me have been financial ones, generally. So Michelle and I have, for 5 years, overseen a couple of older houses that have needed remodeling work, pretty consistent remodeling work. We had our whole basement flooded, had to be gutted. We've done a lot of remodeling, and we've overseen that remodeling, meaning that we've worked with some great service providers, really great. And we've worked with some shady ones, too, that have done, frankly, dishonest business practices. Not just sloppy or expensive, dishonest, straight up dishonest. Now the question is, who will pay for that? Who will pay for that sin debt? It's a sin. When you deceive people in your business, guess what? That's sin, and it matters. But who will pay for that? Well, the first step in moving forward in that sin debt is, first of all, making it so that person or that group can't continue to add to their sin debt against me, thereby adding to their guilt and adding to my frustration. So my first step is to not hire them again, right? If possible, to not hire them again. And that is a move of wise stewardship. God hasn't called Christians to be gullible noobs and dunces. No, we're to operate in wisdom. And so it's really the heart behind, next slide, our outside engagement kit. So inside of that is an inventory of local service providers that we recommend. So the first step is to help people who are newcomers to our valley not move into the same conflict situation and sin debt accrual that we have. That's just straight up hospitality and compassion. That's why on your seat you have right there this local services inventory. If you know of a service provider that's really good, that's blessed you, write them down. inside of that outreach kit, we have that list of local service providers for new people. So when they come in, they're like, oh, they love that. Trust me, I've given these out before. Even if you don't give the basket away, I know some of you just take the cup, that's cool. Make sure that the local service provider inventory goes inside that cup. Because when they're new to the valley, they know no one. They don't know any better. And oftentimes, they're going to fall into those same, frankly, sinful relationships unawares. So our job in basic hospitality is to help them avoid that, thereby helping that provider not incur extra guilt for the bad work they're going to do and the deceitful practices. So that's a first step, right? Let's try not to have that happen over and over again. Let's use our wisdom and our stewardship. But even if that's possible, and that's a wise and good move, don't feel bad about that. But even where that's possible, this Lord's Prayer actually deals with the sin debt that's already been accrued upon you. Because unless you're willing to flee to a monastery, you're going to be harmed and done wrong by. You're just going to be. I actually stayed with a group of Benedictine monks who spent every hour silent except 1 hour a week. That's what they got to talk for 1 hour a week. Hardcore. Anyways, so when that hour came, man, they were talking like crazy, right? And they still had to forgive each other, right? So even if you are in a weirdo environment that's totally secluded from most of the real world, you're still going to be wronged by other people if you're in any sort of real relationship. The question that this deals with, the Lord's Prayer, is what do you do with the sin debt already accrued against you? Try not to have it happen over and over again if possible, but at times you can't help it. So what do you do with that? What do you do when somebody sins against you? That's what this is about. Because that's the question. What are you going to do with that? Now, the secular culture has almost no good advice on this. If you look to a self-help book and look to Wisdom About Forgiveness, it's going to tell you basically two things. Here, it's this. Use your reason, man. Think about it. If you invest in vengeance, that's a poor investment. It's only going to make you bitter. You'll never be satisfied, right? So don't do it. That's what they're going to tell you. If you're going to do this, if you've been wronged by other people, then don't pay it back because it's only going to make you frustrated and it will never really pay that person back. You know the old saying, like, holding on to bitterness is like you drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. It doesn't work. You're just caught in bitterness. But I don't care. Pure reason won't rescue you from vengeance and the cycle of vengeance. Eye for an eye will only leave everyone blind. But you can't help not doing it because you're more than pure reason. You're not just reasonable creatures. You're not. So even though you know that's wrong, have you done this? You're like, I can't stop hating them. I can't stop wishing for their demise. I can't help but want them to get that payback. There's passive and active vengeance. Active vengeance is slander. Passive vengeance is mental murder. I murder that person over and over again in my mind. But pure reason alone won't be able to, just in an accounting way, like that's not wise for me to use my time now. The second thing that a secular source, self-help books and forgiveness will tell you is just forget it. Just forget it, right? But amnesia is impoverished to really help you forget something. Because even if you forget about it for a while, burying a sin debt alive just means it's going to resurrect at some point. It's like mosquito eggs in a dry season. You might not see them until the conditions are right to resurrect them, and they're coming back. And that's what happens. When that old wound is touched again, it reanimates itself because that sin debt has not truly been canceled, right? So the culture has no good answers for how you can escape the cycle of vengeance, active and passive. There is a gospel narrative. It looks like this. No one gets away with anything. Make them pay. That's a cultural narrative. The gospel narrative looks really similar at the front end of it. No one gets away with anything. Those look exactly the same. Let's geek out on a little grammar. The cultural narrative, part A, is an imperative. It's a command. No one gets away with anything. Do not let anyone get away with anything. Part A of the gospel narrative, it's the same words, but it's an indicative fact statement. The truth is nobody gets away with anything. It's an indicative fact. It's a cold, hard fact that no one gets away with anything in God's economy. See, the reason why we desire justice is because we've been made in the image of a God who cares about justice. Like, justice matters to God, and holiness matters to God, which validates your own hurt. If you've been sinned against, that's painful. And the gospel takes nothing away from that. It says it is painful. Sin is sad. It's destructive. That's why God's against it. It's very validating. It's like, I'm not going to take anything away from that, the gospel will say. But it's the second half of that narrative that changes everything. That's the math which only happens outside of yourself that makes grace and forgiveness possible. Christ pays. No one gets away with anything, which is very, very much for your human longings. It coordinates with your human longings. God is the God of justice. You've been made in his image. That's why you long for justice when you've been wronged unfairly or somebody else has been wronged unfairly. No one has to train you to say, that's wrong. You feel it in your gut because you were made in the image of God who finds that very wrong. But the thing about that is, he finds all sin wrong. Not just the sin that others have done against you, but the sin you've done too. Right? That's the part. See, the sin others have been done against you, you're like, I like a God of vengeance. For your own sin, you're like, let's not get too serious about sin. But God cares about holiness. He cares about justice. And the fact that no one gets away with anything is an indicative statement that someday there will be a day of accounting. Every wrong will be paid for. Remember I said, every wrong is always paid for. In the accounting of God's moral economy, every wrong is paid for. Both the wrong others have done to you, which can give you peace to let it go, but also the wrong you've done to other people, or the wrong you've done to the God who you deserve, and he deserves everything. Right? So it goes both ways. Here's the beauty of it. Christ pays. Oh, that's so huge. That is so huge. The idea that Christ has picked up an enormous tab for you, an enormous debt that you could never handle yourself. Christ pays for that. That changes the mathematics of the moral economy. It changes everything. And it makes grace and forgiveness possible. Because you're rich. You're rich. There's a parable called the unmerciful servant. It's in the book of Matthew. It's a great one. Christ tells it. It goes like this. There was a king who decided to settle the accounts with his servants. So he brought a servant to settle his account, and it was found that this servant owed him $4 billion. It's a ridiculous sum on purpose. You owe me $4 billion. Pay it. $4 billion. I want it now. Pay it. And the servant can't pay it. And he falls on his knees on the mercy of the king, and he says, please be merciful with me. I can't pay that. And the king says, I will be merciful. Your debt is forgiven. Now think about this. That person who embezzled $4 billion is rich, aren't they? I mean, you can't even waste $4 billion. It's not possible. You got some assets somewhere. Even if you wasted $2, you've got $2 billion. You can't pay your debt, but you're rich, right? And you've just been forgiven much. And the parable says that same servant went out and he found somebody who owed him $20. And the guy said, I don't have it. Be merciful to me. But the servant grabbed that guy and started choking him. Pay me what you owe me. He took that guy and put him in prison. Well, the king found out about it. And the king said to that same servant, you wicked servant, I've forgiven you so much. Ought you not forgive somebody who owes you so less? That's the concept. You're rich. If you're in Christ, you're rich. You're filthy rich with God's grace. And if you've been forgiven much, then you ought to be able to forgive people less. Right? And it's a really basic concept of this math. Because Christ pays, you're rich. If you're in Christ, you're rich. So you can afford to absorb the cost of other people's wrongs against you. You can afford that. You are so wealthy. You're so wealthy. And forgiveness isn't easy. The truth is, it's even for a Christian, it's going to come back to you like an old wound. You just put it to death. You keep, when it comes up and wants to resurrect it yourself, you say, no, that's been paid for. It's been paid for. I absorbed it, and I gave it to the ultimate loan manager of that person's life to seek payment. It's not up to you. Ultimately, there is a God of justice. Remember, no one gets away with anything. And I want you to imagine somebody who's done you a wrong, a real wrong. Somebody who's an enemy. This shouldn't be too hard, right? We have good memories, right? I want you to imagine somebody who's done you wrong. So conjure that up in your mind, because it helps when it's real. Think about this. That person who harmed you likely is very, very grace poor. Aren't they? It's why they operate the way they do usually. They're grace poor. You are rich. You are a billionaire. You had somebody without shoes seeking bread and tattered clothes steal something from you and wrong you. They're poor. They're so poor. They have no clue what love is. No clue. They've never known the beauty and lightness of forgiveness by a God who actually paid it for them out of incredible love and sacrifice. Took all that, which it says right there, for our sake Christ became sin, who knew no sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. Jesus picked up your tab. You are filthy rich in the grace of God. And it's only people who receive the grace of God and his generosity who can then bend it out to people who have paid and incurred a sin debt that's much, much smaller. That's the concept. That's what makes this gospel narrative possible. And it changes things. It stops that cycle of violence. I mean, look, turn on your TV or look into your own heart. That cycle of violence, unless it's stopped, the vengeance will just continue to spin. We see it on TV. You can see it in your own life as you deal with bitterness. I'm not saying this is easy, but it's possible. It's actually also underpins how we think about how we try to do life together here. We have a covenant for life together. It's this yellow one. We talked about it last week. Our new members that we're about to take in, we'll sign it and put it on that board, staple it there. You can also do that whether you're a member here or not. It's just an agreement. Hey, we're going to navigate life together, and here's some things that make it possible because we're going to hurt each other. Guaranteed. The only time you have a church that doesn't get into conflict is a church that's basically a funeral home, where everyone's bringing like their 9th priority and all their little tiny energy and resources forward. They don't get into conflict because they're dead. Anyone who has passion, difference of opinion, an urgency to see the valley reached, which we are called to do, is going to get into conflict. You're going to get into conflict. That's why it's written. I just picked out a few. These are the principles for our life together, which if you sign this, you're saying, I'm in with this. And the biblical ideas are behind it. Here, let me read a couple of them. One says, number 4, we believe the best of each other and extend to each other the benefit of the doubt. That's a great one. It helps avoid some conflict. But as in any family, we accept disagreement, conflict, and evaluation as normal and natural in our church family. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be a need to seek and grant forgiveness. All the time. All the time. Unless you're dead or you're just showing up as a drone, you're going to get in conflict here. And we think about that. That's going to be natural, normal. But number 8, in this regard, when conflict does arrive, we seek to deal constructively with disagreement by avoiding unhelpful triangulation of conflict. Remember the fire cycle? That never helps anyone. I have a problem with you. I go to my ally. We both murder you in our heads. That's the triangulation of conflict. Never works, poisons the organization, it breaks the family. So that's immaturity. Maturity is going to the person and saying, I feel hurt by you, or this is something I don't understand that you did. Let's talk about it. You can grant and accept forgiveness. The beauty is when you're rich in the grace of God, you're able to grant forgiveness and absorb the cost. You're also more likely to seek forgiveness because you can admit you're wrong. And your identity and your value is not up for grabs because you're already so rich. You've been adopted into the family of God. That's why Christians can actually bend forgiveness out to each other, seek forgiveness from each other, and do life together. The church is stronger. It's just stronger than any other institution I've been a part of, and I've been a part of lots. And if you don't think so, what happens when those groups get into conflict and they don't have to stay together because of a financial reason? They blow apart. These churches have been going for decades, centuries, millennia. It's not going anywhere. But part of the reason is grace brings it together. It's the same reason why this guy can make music. You know, if those strings, I don't know how many strings are in a violin, 4, I think 4. Michelle knows, she has one. You know, if those strings in the violin are all the same, there is no harmony. He can't make real music, right? If every string is identical to the other string, I don't know what it's going to sound like. It's probably just going to sound like this. Because you need actual different strings, but in tune to each other. The church is made up of different people. We're about to have 13 new members up here. We're going to tell you a little bit about themselves before you make vows to them. If you're a member here, they make vows to you, right? And they're different from each other. And in order for us to make music to the glory of God in this valley, they need to be different, right? There's no music if everyone's a clone. And so we embrace the differences, and we also realize that when we have a covenant for life together, we can take those differences and see the beauty in the diversity, and God can do something because he works with real people. And if you're rich because of the grace of God, it gives you a whole bunch of reservoir to do life with other people. So let's call the new members up, candidates. Let's hear from them a bit.